Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Everest. I'm going to attempt to keep order during the course of this morning with greater or lesser degrees of success. You will have to be the judge. Our session is called Editing and Interpreting Lost Melodies, and we have two papers before the break, only one afterwards. The paper by Richard Robinson has been cancelled. The good news is that we get to lunch slightly earlier, but we are going to try and keep to time. I know people have got to get places and everything. So the first two papers that we have this morning are largely based around issues of the digital presentation of music from the long 13th century. And our first speaker is Solomon Guhl-Miller, who teaches at Rutgers University in New Jersey. Somebody's got to. And he's published widely on a number of subjects, ranging from ancient Greek music to Wagner. He tells me he has an article forthcoming in the Journal of the Royal Musical Association on irregular modes and anonymous form. You'll all enjoy reading that as much as I will, I'm sure. And recently, he's received a grant from the NEH in the United States to work on a digital edition of Notre Dame Polyphony. And his thoughts on that project as it relates to the Codex Buranus, I think, is the subject of his paper today, which is called A Possible Digital Edition of the Music of the Codex Buranus. Solomon, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mark. Good morning. I come to the question, how do we create a useful digital edition of the music of the Codex Buranus from the world of Notre Dame organum? Because of that, I'd like to address some of the challenges I faced when I proposed a digital edition for that repertoire as an introduction to the slightly different problems an edition of the music of the Codex Buranus presents. The main problem my proposed Notre Dame edition tried to solve was, how do you create a scholarly edition of music for a repertoire that is conceived like a choose-your-own-adventure story? For the past 150 years, the modus operandi for critical editions has been to select a most likely choice, usually referred to as an urtext, and state either directly or implicitly that that version is the definitive version, while others are secondary alternatives. For some repertoires, that works, but for others, it is a highly problematic assumption. Take Chopin, for example. There are dozens of original manuscripts in Chopin's handwriting which give alternative versions of key piano works. Each manuscript is written by Chopin, so how do you select a correct version? The earliest public version, the latest written version. What does authenticity even mean in a context where Chopin seems disinterested in playing his works in a fixed form? The University of Cambridge and King's College worked together to create the online Chopin Variorum edition. This edition allows users to view a list of all the manuscripts associated with a particular work, select a manuscript for viewing, and then click on a specific measure in that manuscript to see a page that compares all versions of that measure side by side from the various manuscripts that contain the work in question. In this case, the Mazurka Opus 6, number 1. This kind of edition goes a long way towards decentering the critical edition from the urtext model, but it is still a challenge to use, particularly for performers who would benefit from seeing more than one measure side by side for comparison, and would also benefit from seeing every manuscript in a clearly notated transcription. But again, this is a step forward from the older model of critical edition. This is one of the problems that we see in 13th century music. Each organum exists in somewhere between 1 and 9 different manuscripts, and each manuscript represents its own variation, so there is almost never absolute consistency between versions. This is also the least complicated problem in this repertoire. Compound that with the substitute clausula problem, in which clausula may be substituted for a section of discant into an existing organum, making organum more of a choose-your-own-adventure story than a book, as well as the problem of how to read the rhythms, and we arrive at a series of problems which cannot all be addressed by the standard urtext model of editions. The question of rhythm is divided into two issues, rhythm for organum purum and rhythm for discant. In my Musica Disciplina article, I made a case that depending on which theorist you were looking at, the rhythm of organum purum could be performed differently. In what I defined as the late reading or late phase of reading the rhythms of organum purum, the ligatures follow Franco of Cologne's teachings, in which all organum was performed according to the rhythmic modes, perfectly rhythmicized, as we have seen in transcriptions by Waite and Tischler from before the 1980s, as we see here in the following transcription of Hic Dies. In what I called a middle phase of reading organum purum, I proposed that note length was a function of the level of consonance between the two voices. Rather than dividing consonance level into two note values as Reckhoff did, longs for consonance and shorts for dissonance, or dividing consonance level into 13 separate note values as Judkin did, I divided the 13 intervals into 4 categories of lengths based on readings of Johannes de Garlandia, Anonymous 4, Anonymous of St. Emmeram, and Franco of Cologne, which divided the 13 intervals into 5 or 6 categories of consonance and dissonance, as you can see from the table here. In the transcriptions using this reading, I employed prosodic symbols above each note, indicating a general, not specific, sense of contextual length. Here is the same organum transcribed using this model. In what I called the earliest or premodal phase, I called upon the work of primarily Guido and Arribo. These writers divided a texted melody into melodic segments. The last note of the smallest segment, sometimes called a syllaba, was lengthened a little. The last note of the middle range segment, sometimes called a pars, was lengthened a little more. And the last note of the large segment, sometimes called a distinctio, was lengthened even more. Karen Desmond summarized this idea with the following graphic summarizing Arribo's explanation of this concept from his gloss of the Micrologus in her Journal of Musicology article. As the example demonstrates, in the full line, or distinctio, dixit dominus mulieri caneni, the first word dixit represents a syllaba, and so the last syllable, tsit, is lengthened slightly. The last syllable of the first pars, dixit dominus, is us, and it is lengthened a bit more. And the last syllable of the complete distinctio on a is lengthened the most. I applied this notion to textless organum, grouping in terms of phases or of phrases or melodic units rather than text. The result was something like the following. Just looking at the top line, you can see 2 groups of 3 small units each divided by stricha, the lines indicating phrase breaks in the original manuscript. I considered each unit the equivalent of a syllaba, and so lengthened the last note of each one, indicating the slight lengthening with a dot. I considered the first 3 units together as a single pars, and so lengthened the end of the 3rd unit with a charon, and I considered the 6 groups together a complete distinctio, and so lengthened the last note of the 6th unit with a macron. While this is how I adjusted Guido's and Arribo's teachings to accommodate music with minimal text, it perhaps is already clear how this could be applied productively to the texted music of the Codex Buranus, and this will be discussed in more detail shortly. Now there is the question of the rhythm of discant. Discant is governed by the so-called rhythmic modes, 6 patterns of ligatures that are used to indicate 6 different rhythms. While the meaning of the ligatures can often be deciphered from context, in many discant passages and motets, there is no context to use to decipher the rhythmic meaning of the ligatures in the tenor. Many tenors are made up of a series of 3-note ligatures, as we can see here in the motet Si vera visit here, on the in seculum tenor from the organum Hic Dies. With something like this, without context, what rhythm is the tenor part supposed to be? Garlandia offers us this helpful guide. So we have 3 units together. If we see 3 units together, we know that it's in first mode. And then we have 3 units together. So if it's in 3 units together, it's going to be the second mode. And then we have 3 units together. So whenever we see 3 units together, we know it's going to be the fourth mode. And then we have 3 units together. So every time you see 3 units together, you know it's the fifth mode. Thank you, Garlandia. So the way out of this confusion is to recognize, as Garlandia Anonymous 4 and Anonymous of St. Emmeram did, that the singers themselves were meant to have a hand in how the music was performed. Garlandia states that when creating a tenor, the singers give a mode to a chant, and this is then called the root of the chant. And Anonymous 4 famously said that the performers decided how to interpolate the music. Quote, "In the old books they had notes that were too equivocal, for the single notes were all alike. So they performed by understanding alone, saying, I understand that note to be long and that note to be short. They considered the relation between the higher part and the lower and taught others, saying, listen to us and remember, and then singing it." Broadening the search and the discussion of rhythm as far back as Boethius, a range of authors writing between about 500 and 1279, including Boethius, Aurelian, the author of the Schola Cantorum, Guido, Anonymous of St. Emmeram, all state roughly that performers assign meters to music not based on the text or by reason, but by inclination. Aurelian speaks of a natural impulse, which must be used instead of reason in setting a text to a meter. The Schola Cantorum recommends reversing the meter of a song, making what was long short and what was short long, for the sake of causa variationis, variation. Guido writes that meters are assigned to song not by reason, but by whether the mind is pleased by them. And finally, Anonymous of St. Emmeram speaks directly of modal transmutation and says that singers could, quote, convert all motets that are put together and made in the third or fourth species and the fifth, similarly from the long mode into the short, and also the other way around, without any trouble, by mutual will. Based on these statements, it seems that the early notation was not inexact because the technology was not yet available to be more exact, but because it stemmed from a culture which embraced metric flexibility according to mutual will and needed to be loose enough to accommodate multiple metric readings. There is then an argument to be made that texted music like discant, but also crucially, as it was the rhythm of monophonic song that Boethius, Aurelian, and the author of the Schola Cantorum and Guido were describing, that monophonic song ought to be read not only in a logical meter, which fits the rhythm of the words, but in opposing meters for the sake of variety. This understanding is directly opposed to the or-text critical addition model and requires a different type of addition. So at very least, for the performers, we need an addition which includes multiple rhythmic renderings of music as allowed by the notation and can facilitate, for the Notre Dame repertoire, easy switches between organum and clausula in such a way that performers have the same degree of control of the music they sing as they did before the advent of more exact notation. For the scholars, we need side-by-side additions that we can use to compare versions, looking for elements of compositional process. Other elements, like a search tool to identify melodic patterns to easily find musical quotation, would also be useful, but for now, this is a good start. If we were interested in making a print edition, we would look at this list and decide what to do without. But with a digital edition, all of these things are possible. So here was my proposed version. The left side offers a clear list of organa, clausulae, and motets based on Ludwig's and van der Werf's standard cataloging of this repertoire. Clicking on an item from the list will make the piece appear in its original notation on the right side of the screen, ready for analysis or performers. The arrows move to the next page in items with multiple pages. Back to the beginning. If we would like to switch to modern notation, this can be done by pressing the interpretation button. In cases of organum purum, this interpretation would be the three hypothetical phases I laid out. Here they are. Or with a motet, like the In Seculum si vere vis et herere from W2 I showed you earlier, with that problematic tenor built on a series of three-note ligatures, that could imply nearly any mode. We could click the interpretation button and explore the 5 modal solutions for this motet. While this list on the left side does present works according to their catalog number, it does not address how organa, clausulae, and motets are related. This is where concordance and related works buttons come in. They serve multiple functions. First, they can toggle between versions. We can go back to Haec Dies. By pressing concordances, we then see what and where the other two voice versions of the organum are and can explore the original chant from, in this case, Paris Lat 1112, clausulae and motets as well. If we choose to look at the W1 version, we hover over W1 in the menu, open, and if we wish to compare F to W1 in a side-by-side comparison, we can do the following. One of the frustrating things I found about Tischler's comparative edition is the sheer amount of information that is together on the page. It is overwhelming at times, and I've found I miss things. One of the clear ways we can identify compositional process is by discovering how the composer manipulated the chant line. By having an option which views only the chant line, we can see exactly this. So let's click on tenor only, which is what we did here. We are then given a list of items, and yep, there we go. So I think I skipped ahead. That's okay. Anyway, okay. An interesting picture emerges here. Vertical lines are the striche, so we can see clausulae 1, 2, F74, F23, and F235 are largely organized the same way. The passage is repeated and the notes are grouped in 3-note ligatures. In F75, the chant is repeated twice, but appears to be missing the first 2 notes. F76 is repeated 4 times and is grouped by 4s, but is missing several of the notes from the chant. Did the 4-note grouping affect the discant and require changes to be made? But if F77 and F78, which garner the most interest, they do not repeat completely like the other examples, with the same groupings of notes between striche at both times. For example, in F78, we see a tenor pattern of 2, then 3, and so on. So A, G, B flat, A, G, A, F, A, C, C. The second time, the shift changes the pattern. What was A, G becomes A, A, then B flat, A, G is shifted to G, B flat, A, F to G, A, C, C to F, A, C. They shift the tenor notes into different groups the second time around, thus necessitating a change in the discant. With these examples, we see the hand of the composer at work, something hardly possible if we were staring at editions. Imagine something like this was available for all organa. How much would we learn about this repertoire, and how many more questions would we know to ask? Finally, let's get to swapping out sections. Say the user does not wish to start with the organum from F, but with the clausula F74. This is where the Create button comes into play. Once you click Create, a blank template opens up on the right side of the screen. You click F74 by clicking Concordances, then Clausula, then F74. If we want our edition to be in the original notation, we copy this over to our blank template. If we want a modern transcription, we can click Interpretation and choose a possible mode with this clausula. A clausula with groups of 3-note ligatures in the tenor and an unclear duplum can work. I will select mode 1 and then copy it to the blank template. Next comes the chant. So we go back to concordance, click the chant, and copy and paste it like so. We would then pick the next section and so on. When we are done, we can save it as a PDF and print it out. We will then have a singable edition that the performer user chose and made from the available content at hand, just like a medieval singer would have done. All told, we have an edition for scholars and performers alike, which is readable and functional, and something that will encourage us to ask and answer some really fascinating questions about this music. After addressing these problems, we can now examine a possible direction for the music of the Codex Buranus. While the notation of these works gives us some basic shapes, it is not enough alone to give performers a functional performance edition. For performers new to the repertoire, the standard edition is Klementsch's Gesamtausgabe der mittelalterlichen Melodien, which transcribes one of the concordances of the music of the Codex, which survives in readable pitch notation like manuscripts F, the Chancellor du Roi, and Noailles. This is great for the performer, but problematic for the scholar, in that we are presented with a transcription, often in two voices, as here, when the music in the Codex is only in one voice. We have no side-by-side examination of the modern notation with the notation of the Codex, and we are instructed in the notes that, quote, this could be performed in other modes with one or more voices, end quote, but are not given advice on how to do this. In this sense, Heike Lammers' dissertation offers much more useful information by the scholar, or for the scholar. Here, in a typical example from CB 14, O Varium Fortuna, we see side-by-side transcriptions, not just of the first strophe, but every strophe in the song, with more modern concordances of the song found in manuscript F and the Roman de Fauvel. This gives readers the ability to see where the neumes of the Codex disagree with each other, depending on the strophe, as well as where the melodic shapes both agree and diverge from the more fixed examples in the concordances. While this is a good start, it is missing the performer's aid in translating this information into possible transcriptions. So here is what I might like to see as a component of a possible digital edition of this music. We start with a list of works along with their major concordances. For our purposes today, I'll be focusing on CB 31, Vita Perdita, which is in 9 verses and on folio 4 of the Codex. If we click on Vita Perdita, we will see its concordances in Paris 844, the Chanson du Roi, Paris 12615 or Noailles, manuscript F, and R71 from Milan. If we would like to compare the original notation of Vita Perdita from the Codex with its concordances, we can click on Concordances, and we will be given a menu including the 9 verses of Vita Perdita and the 4 manuscripts with its concordances. We can select, for example, the first 4 verses and the 4 concordances, and we'll get this view. I aligned each neume with the text so it offers the eye a direct comparison between parts, and I include a shape transcription of each neume. We can immediately identify the similarities and differences between the notationally fixed concordances and the notation from the Codex Buranus. While there is much alignment between longs and puncta, or virgae, there are numerous examples where we see a 2-note pes against a long. One particularly notable difference is the 3-note porrectus, which appears as the penultimate neume in every line and every verse. For example, over the de of subdideram and the te of discutere in the first lines of the first and second verses, and it does not have a parallel in the concordances. Moving to interpretation, we can follow the guideline, as I did for discant and motets, that there need not be a single fixed rhythmic interpretation of this music. So if we would like to explore, for example, the Noailles version, we can click on the interpretation button and then click the boxes for the versions we'd like to see, including transcriptions in modes 1, 2, and 5, as well as a version highlighting Guidonian rhythm. If we do that, we get the following. Performers can review each of these versions, all technically following theoretical guidelines, and create a version which best suits their vision, much as the 13th century theorists recommended. Combining these 2 pieces of evidence, viewers can then review possible transcriptions of the neumes from the Codex Buranus. We can click on Reconstructions, so that's the second page. We can click on Reconstructions, and we are given a list of first the 9 original versions and then altered versions of each concordance. For this section, I altered the versions of the 4 concordances to fit with the neumes of the Codex, adding hypothetical notes to fill in the differences between the concordances and the Codex. As before, in addition to these melodic variants, each version is given in a rhythmic scheme reflecting modes 1, 2, and 5. Let's go overboard and review all the versions with the first two verses from the Codex Buranus as a reference. Performers can review these versions for the edition that best suits them. The version in F, the only version in the same language as the Codex, fits particularly well with and needs the least alteration from the version in the Codex, in part because it follows the same syllabic grouping pattern. Both F and the Codex divide the first two lines, each composed of 12 syllables, into groups of 5 plus 7 respectively, as opposed to the remaining versions which either do not subdivide the lines or divide them into groups of 8 plus 4. The consistent use of the bi-virga on the 5th syllable in the Codex, extending the length of the 5th syllable, aligns with the use of a strich after the 5th syllable in manuscript F. Because of this closeness, I selected the F version, the bottom voice in particular, of this Ligeti score, because its shape most closely aligns with the neumes in the Codex, to also use a Guidonian interpretation, which you see on the bottom line. In yesterday's concert, I was struck right away by the two different rhythmic interpretations of the first song, CV 143, Ecce Gratum. The first singer sang what I have been describing as a Guidonian rhythm, and then when the shawm entered, the next verse was performed in mode 1. The amount of work they put into those interpretations as students and performers who are not only willing but eager to investigate and hypothesize solutions is easily imaginable to this group. Now consider another type of ensemble, curious, but not enough to learn the musical language of notation. If they were handed the type of edition I propose and wanted to create an edition of Vitae Perdite, we could hit the create button. They could simply highlight the Guidonian bottom line from this page. And then copy the mode 1 version. And they're done in a minute without the struggle. Obviously, the struggle is part of the experience and is itself an excellent teacher. But if our goal is to encourage more students and performers to perform this music, giving them numerous possible options will help train their ears and their stylistic expectations in a way that will make them be more ready to engage with the struggle. This is my goal in proposing an edition of this type. It is something functional for both scholars and performers, giving singers opportunities to review possible options on the way to building familiarity with the style, and giving scholars the ability to easily compare concordances side by side, which could lead to questions we didn't even know to ask. I'm really looking forward to our next paper, which will address questions I couldn't have imagined. But hopefully, as the online edition of the Codex Buranus is prepared, there will be a place for these types of comparisons and functionalities in addition to the range of marvels about which we are about to learn and which will shape the study of this codex for years to come. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you, Solomon, for that, what I consider to be an extraordinarily lucid and clear exploration of how we might deal with the complexities of these kind of multi-textual works across a range of sources, across a range of practices and traditions. I have far too many questions than is good for me, and I'm hoping that people will have kind of questions from the floor for Solomon. Otherwise, I'm just going to have a conversation with him. Okay. Uri.
Hi, Solomon. Thanks very much. This is really, really interesting. One element that I thought could be both a complete headache to trying to integrate into an edition, but is in a way essential, would be a flexibility element, especially in the way that your lovely early, middle, late theoretical understanding of what to do with this music is concerned. Because the description that you gave of how flexible the theorists say what musicians do as the basic situation of how the music lives, I think has to apply also to the very system that these theorists then provide. And therefore, the suggestion that this is what it looks like if you follow Guido is true if you follow Guido, but you have, especially if you then want to make it into an edition, it would be great to be able also to change and say, actually here I don't want to do that, I want to lead on rather than stop, or I understand this strich as something else. And that kind of flexibility in relation to the theoretical precepts that are described is something that I think also needs to be integrated. Otherwise, it just seems like there's a truth, and you can follow this truth or this truth or this truth. That's already first step. But you know what I mean, to make the truth more malleable, as politics nowadays seem to suggest.
No, that's great. So there are some digital tools available that will allow changes in the edition itself that you can alter one at a time. I think we're talking about, two different stages of familiarity with this material. In an earlier stage, for performers who really need help, these offer a basic guideline. Once you get past that stage, it should be admitted that these are suggestions, and that's why we look at the original notation and that we do have this kind of flexibility, and then within that scope, you can take one of the versions and alter it in some way. But it's really, the level of development of the user indicates how you treat the database. Just whether it is XYZ truths, suggested truths that you can then begin to use to build a period ear, followed by, once you've built that period ear, saying, okay, well, I could also do that, and then you adjust it, and then you do something a little bit different. But yes, that's a really great point, and the technology is slowly catching up to these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you again. Also too many questions, but just to complicate matters further, have you also considered the rhythmizations that Hieronymus de Moravia suggests for chant in the late 13th century? And can they be consolidated with the views that with the early, medium, and late versions that is he talking about the same thing or something similar? I'm also excited about your Anonymous 4 publication forthcoming, so please keep us updated on that.
Sure, thanks. So Hieronymus of Moravia does use something similar to the idea outlined in Guido and Aribo and the like. It's just he gives fixed lengths for the ends of the syllables, which strikes me as a modernistic interpretation of earlier teachings rather than something that we should necessarily consider to be fixed. That said, it would be easy enough once you're familiar with Hieronymus of Moravia and you're familiar with this style to adjust the original notation reading to fit into a more clear beat pattern that would reflect Hieronymus of Moravia. Again, this is a question of how we use it and who is using it. In the initial stage, you really just, enough suggestions to help build the period ear are all we really, is the goal, because we just want to hear more of this music. Then after that, there can be some kind of additional material recommendations. You can have infinite space online, so this could take 100 years with people adding additional material as they see fit, and people can look at those options as well. And that's another way that these other chant theories could be interpreted, so, and incorporated into the database. But yeah, that's one of the advantages of a database like this. You don't need to be limited. We don't need the or-text model. So yeah, thank you.
It's really interesting, Solomon, to listen to all of this and remember having spent significant chunks of my life editing what you're calling an urtext edition for the Oiseau-Lyre Manusliber Organi edition, and to realize just exactly how right you are, and how wrong that Manusliber Organi edition really was. I suppose the question for me is, or at least the question that you seem to be inviting us to consider, is not just what performers have in front of them as they play or sing, but actually what material they work with as they actually get to that point of walking on stage and playing. And I was struck last night by the fact that pretty well everybody was singing or playing from memory. But I was wondering what that actually meant. You know, what the learning process actually involved. And what you're talking about here is that process, isn't it? Is how you get from vom Codex of Klang, right? That's what we're looking at. And I guess this goes back to Uri's question about whether these are over prescribed, and I suppose my question is: are these really over prescriptions? I think you've actually already said this. Are these really over prescriptions in a digital edition like this, or are they things that are further back in the learning process for a performance? In other words, you know, that it's kind of mediated primary sources that we're dealing with. They're not prescriptive things like a Wiener Urtext of Brahms, for example, where I suppose the idea is you are supposed to kind of, you know, play what's on the page. Right? but I think I'm just repeating what you said in reply to Uri, really, which is that. My interest is what you look at as you sing, which may be, as we saw last night, nothing, because it's already been that work has already been done before you get remotely close to an audience.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you for making my points.
Thanks again. But I think my main question, in a way, is from a kind of didactic point of view of you know, us all sitting here, is what degree of respect do you, or how do we train our students to have the right amount of disrespect to any one of these sources without then going overboard? Because I'm completely with you with this project thing. It's amazing. But it depends on how users expect to treat it. Mm-hmm. And as you well know, teaching Rutgers, or you know, all of us have experience teaching in places where this is a very minor part of the curriculum. Most students expect to take a bit of notation and do as they're told.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so a part of our job is also to think about how to undermine to the right amount the doing as you are told element of it. That's the only reason why I kind of raise a note of caution, because that's an important element of making the transition possible from just seeing different versions to then saying, okay, I'll select this and do that, and then on top of that, I'll change the ones I selected because I want something a little bit different. That's all okay, I think requires also thought in professional education, both for theorists and performers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, when you have, if you are going to take this project into the 100 years version, where you have 1 million different versions of these things, that is just another way of terrifying students. You can't possibly expect them to look at all of that, but you can expect them to look at 4 options. And that's one of the reasons why I aimed for these 4 basic, somewhat complementary but distinct rhythmic choices. The Guidonian, what I call the Guidonian version, and then 1, 2, and 5 modes. If you work with singers, as we all have worked with singers, it opens the door. And at this point, we're really just interested in opening as many doors as possible without overwhelming. And you know, once you have been there, once they can sing these different versions, they don't have a clear idea of what sounds right or what sounds wrong, but they can start listening to other recordings. And that's where the teaching process really comes in. You inspire other recordings, you lead through performance sessions, and you ask them questions about how something sounds versus something else sounds. You kind of force the inquisitive part of their brain into motion, and then you back off, and they take over from there. But yes, it is a problem if you have too many choices for students. And that's another, again, that's an advantage to having a limited collection at first that can just be very basic interpretations, and then from there going to ask more complicated questions through at first directed instruction from an instructor, and then opening it up to more personal adventures. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I like the idea of choosing between different options very much. My question to you is, don't you think that students who are not familiar with early music, who come across it via such an edition, might default to the version that looks most familiar to them, which is a rhythmicized version? And then kind of ignore the other suggestions that are a bit more alien to a first look at the music. Having said that, I felt that I find it somewhat I wouldn't say comparable, but I was reminded of the new Carmina Burana edition that we find online, where you can choose between the original notation and a note-head notation with the original notation above to inform your interpretation from note-head notation. And I found the approach via that mixture very helpful with students to get away from a perceived fixed rhythm, such as the one that might be suggested by one that has note values, a prescriptive notation, so to speak. So my question in this respect would be, could it be an option to provide note-head notation with a rhythm above, instead of being in the notation itself?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I always feel that, sorry that I interject again, I always feel that putting the students a bit at unease can be helpful, rather than providing something that seemingly works without question.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have something like that, if you go back enough. So this version is relatively close to that. In this particular case, I picked 4 verses that you can compare, and then I picked the original notation of the 4 different sources, including the 2-voice version in Florence. Now, you don't have to do this. This is the scholar view, so where you can make comparisons and talk about compositional process and the like. For students, I'd probably recommend looking at 1 verse and 1 version. And then that way you have this clear association. And I include the stemless note heads are really just guides for melodic direction for students who are unfamiliar with what the notation means. So you have that line, and then you accompany it with 1 or 2 or however many of the original notation sources, and that basically simulates what you're talking about, what's going on in the other edition. That said, of course students are going to default to the easiest option. They always do. That's their job, to default to the easiest option, and it's our job to make them not do that. So that we include these options because they are viable, but our job as interpreters, as helpers, is to make sure that they don't take the lazy way out all the time.
Oh, and that sounds an ideal point at which to close this particular set of questions. Solomon, thank you very much. That was just splendid. Thank you. So our next speaker is Ugo Bindini, who has a career that has taken him from Ferrara to Pisa to a place in central Finland I'm not even going to begin to try and pronounce, and also to Munich, and then eventually to Basel. He holds a doctorate in mathematics. So please treat him with enormous care and respect, because he understands things that we only pretend to. Most importantly, he is a member of the Carmina Burana Online project here at Basel, and he's going to be talking us through today, in a sense, where Solomon left off at the end of his paper, and I think there should be some interesting and creative overlap. And the formal title of his paper is "Benefits and Duties of Digital Means in Editing the Carmina Burana," which reminds me of, do you remember sort of back in the 90s, there were endless statements about what musicology and music performance ought to be, and the benefits and duties reminds me just a little bit of some of the kind of grandstanding statements that were actually made then, and that proved to be of such importance as we thought some of those issues through during the 90s and the 2000s. And once Ugo has got bits attached to his face, we ought to be able to start. I have to say, I'm very much looking forward to reading a paper with one of these, actually. I associate them mostly with stand-up comedians. So be warned, tomorrow morning is going to be a lot of fun. And now I'm furiously treading water while we're waiting. We are set. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Set and done, yes.
Excellent. Ugo, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you, Mark, for the very nice introduction. Thanks to the organizers for this very, very nice conference. Yes, I'm going to speak today about our work in progress in the digital edition of the Carmina Burana, and how... Yeah, that's just about the light. Great. So I think we've seen this picture a lot in these days. We'll probably see it in the next days as well. The famous fortune wheel. But it's not just a fortune wheel, it is also a wheel of time, since we have on the top, no. On the top, it's I am raining, and then I rained, I'm without any rain, and I will rain. So, and I think this fits very well with the question of transmission of culture, because transmission really is a question of fortune and time, whether a certain manuscript comes to us or not. It just depends on the fate, on the fortune, and on a very, very long amount of time for the Codex Buranus, for example. Well, how does a digital edition fits into this picture? I would argue that nowadays digital edition are definitely on the top of the hill of this wheel of fortune. They are very much present everywhere. They are enjoying a lot of fortune in these days. But how do they compare, or how do they fit into a more general transmission of knowledge framework? So my argument would be that digital edition is a rather poor transmission method. So the material support is not durable. If you think about the Codex Buranus, it lasted 800 years. My PC, I don't think this thing will last 800 years. Readability is unlikely to last very long. So after 800 years, we can still read the parchment and the writing on the Codex Buranus. I think everybody in this room has experience with floppy disks. They are just 50 years old, or maybe less, and we almost cannot read them anymore. So last but not least, the production time is quite inefficient. So like a professional scribe, I think would be able to write a book like the Codex Buranus in about 2 years. We are a team of 4 people working 4 years, and maybe with some luck we'll get finished with our digital edition, so that's maybe like 8 times more expensive. On the other hand, a digital edition is a very rich investigating method. Why? Well, a rigid formal structure enforces very, very careful classification of the textual material and of the musical material, because the parchment is an analogic mean. Digital tools are not. So you're somehow, somewhere, you will be forced to classify your material in a sort of rigid structure. You can have simultaneous access to different sources, and Solomon showed very, very nicely what it means. You basically are able to compare different manuscripts coming from different places, from different times, and really enrich your reading of a single one of them. And also digital tools can allow for a fast and reliable search features. So I think we should, so my focus is going to be how can we exploit these features of a digital edition to enrich our reading of the Codex Buranus, and what can we learn from that? So first point, let's start with encoding the textual structure. As was mentioned yesterday, most of the pieces of the Codex Buranus are just texts. They don't contain any music. So encoding a textual structure is a very, very important part of our job. In most cases, first level division of a Carmen or of an item into units presents no issues. So here we have a couple of pages of the codex, and you can see that the beginning of the items is quite clearly marked. You have the big initial, and you also, most of the times, you also have some rubrication item and so on. Once you identify the items, then you can look at the, no, you can look at the, why is it going so slow? Yes, it's like not reacting to my, maybe I should do this instead, no. Yeah, but it's basically skipping some.
Because it looks good there.
Ah, yes, oh, thanks. I cannot see the green dots on my screen, so, and these smaller red initials are very helpful in subdividing the item into strophes. It's not always the case, but 99% of the time, let's say, you can see where the next strophes begin by looking at the smaller red initials. Once you divided the item into strophes, then comes the problem of dividing them into verses. As you can see, the text is written, of course, without line breaks for verses, as we do today. So how can you do that? This can be more challenging. Let me take, for example, the case of the Vite Perdite. Very nice that we choose the same piece, but from a different angle, I would say. So this is a transcription of the text for the first strophe up to the big, or to the smaller red initial R. How can we sort of try to divide these into verses? Well, of course, you can base yourself on metrics, rhythm, on rhymes, and so on. And so you could end up with a division like that. Vite perdite, me legi subdideram, minus licite, dum fregi, quod vodmeram, and so on. So this would be a possibility, but it's not the only one. Because you can also say, okay, but these verses at the beginning, they're very, very short. So maybe it makes sense to join them in a longer unit like that. Vite perdite, that would be the first verse, and then me legi subdideram would be the second verse, which is actually made up of two half verses. Or maybe you can choose another solution. You can make even longer lines. Vite perdite me legi subdideram, minus licite dum fregi quod voveram, et ad vite vesperam corrigendo legi, and so on. So you can choose to have very, very long verses. And you see already, just by having to divide the text into verses, you are forced to think, what do I do with this metric? Can I somehow, do I have a way of choosing one or the other? So for example, in this case, the last two verses, they form a rather typical pattern, this Goliardic verse. I think we are going to hear more from Davide today about that. This 7 P, 7 preparoxyton plus 6 paroxyton. And they are a very recurring metrical unit in the book, in this kind of poems. So you maybe, it makes sense, I think, to divide in this way. But can we somehow support our argumentation by something that's in the codex? Well, we actually can, because you can see that in the codex there are some dots. They are not like the modern dots. They are not at the end of the sentences, but they are marking in some ways the metrical units, at least for this piece. Because if I try to transcribe the dots, then you see that you can find the dot at the end of these longer versification segments. So that would be a possible grasping point for how to divide the verses. However, this is not the only usage of the dots, and you can never rely basically on features of this codex because it's so varied. Here I show you another example for some different use of the dots. Here on the folio 5 rector, you can see there are a lot of dots. They do not separate the verses, of course, but they rather separate a list of adjectives. Sis pius, justus, sobrius, prudens, pudicus, no dot there because it's at the end of the line, humilis, and so on. And this is not the only case. Here you have another one. In the Ordo Prophetarum, so in the last part of the manuscript, de Marte, de Venere, de Sole, Mercurio, de Jovis Clementia. So they are not separating verses, they are just sort of working as commas to separate items in a list. So I think this raises a lot of questions. What is the role of punctuation signs in this manuscript? How should a digital edition approach this problem of conveying modern punctuation, syntax-based, and the original punctuation of the manuscript, which surely looks to be placed not in a random way, but in a rather thought-out way. And when we divide the verses, can we somehow identify recurring metrical units, such as this Goliardic verse, and how to treat these compound verses as opposed to normal versification? Also, how to represent the complex network of metrical analysis. Now I had just a Latin piece for which we can, rhythmical piece for which we can say the accent is on the penultimate or so on, but we also have German pieces for which the metrical analysis is completely different. And as Mathieu, I think, will show, the relationship between German versification and Latin versification is much more complex than what we thought at the beginning. So how can we somehow make this network work together? But I think enough for the text, since we are in a more in a musicological or music conference. How about the music? Well, as you all know, the Codex Buranus is notated through adiastematic neumes, and they are handwritten, of course, so you require a standardization process. This is very similar to what we normally do with letters. You can group neumes according to shapes. So that is, so that would be some different shapes for the letter D. And on the right, you can see different shapes for a neume, which is in this case possibly virga. As Christelle mentioned already, the notating hand is far from being calligraphic. So these neumes are very spontaneous. We have a lot of different hands. So it's not always easy to identify neumes with 100% certainty. In our work, in progress, we recognized 138 different shapes, different possible neumes, and encoded up to now around 12,000 neumes. Maybe it's a good point to show you some pieces from our website. Yeah, can be a bit bigger maybe. Yes. So this is an example of a rather syllabic piece, Ovarium Fortunae. You can see the manuscript on the right, and our transcription for the adiastematics the thematic neumes on the left. The underlined word is just the critical apparatus of the text or of the neumes. Some pieces are more challenging. This is an example. Remigabat naufragus, not a very syllabic piece. Once again, you can see the manuscript on the right with these red strokes highlighting the melisma and a lot of very complex pneumatic shapes that we had to draw, digitally draw, and then to put on the text. It's funny because what I see here is completely different from what I see there. So the process, as you can imagine, is not always straightforward. As I mentioned already, the notating hands are very far from high calligraphic standard. This is a very interesting example. So these two lines are in the same position inside the strophe. They look very similar, so we suspect that the melody should be more or less the same. If you look at the shapes of the neumes, well, first of all, it's not such a common shape, especially the last part on the right of these neumes. And also at the beginning, you can see on the top line, you have a climacus with 3 dots and then a beginning of a pes. In the second line, you have just the 2 dots and then a quilisma. So I think this raises the question, is the melody the same? Do they correspond to the same? What does the rightmost part of these neumes musically signify? And here another interesting couple of neumes, possibly two virgae, but they definitely seem to have some extra bit on the top. They look some sort of a half liquescence, but on the the phonetic is a bit strange because in the first word in littore you would have the liquescence just on the last of the two virgae, and in compendio you would have it on the first of the two virgae. So what does this extra stroke signify? Is it really an extra stroke or is it just a slip of the pen? If it is a slip of the pen, that would be, I think, very unlikely to have it 4 times in the same metrical position. So I think this is the kind, really shows how trying to standardize these shapes that you find in the manuscript raises a lot of questions. And I would like to point out a very important point. One thing is to standardize the shape. Of course, you can draw any shape you want. And you can say, okay, I just draw a shape that looks more or less like that. And I say, okay, this is the shape of these neumes. Another issue is to encode the musical meaning of these shapes. It's true, of course, completely different question. So do these neumes have a special musical meaning beside having a special shape? This is the kind of questions that really naturally arise as you try to make a digital edition of this manuscript. So summarizing, up to which point should we discard variations? For example, in the vertical position, I think Christel mentioned yesterday in the Veris Dulcis, we have some rudimentary adiastamasi, maybe not. Some neumes are placed higher than the others. Should we discard these variations? Should we keep track of that? Can we discount suspicious shapes or strangely written shapes just as badly written neumes? Or should we account for some idiomatic expressions of the scribes that really meant something musically or maybe rhythmically or prosodically? And is it at all possible to associate to each sign a precise musical, so in this case, melodic meaning. So this shows how making a digital edition, the process of making a digital edition, just opens a lot of questions. And I think, Solomon, I'm very much with you on these points. The point is really opening as much doors as possible. As I mentioned, we are also encoding the related sources. That means the parallel sources that have notated pieces, which are concordances with the Codex Buranus. So Vite per Dite is one of them, as Solomon mentioned. This is the version you can find in the F manuscript, where, of course, we can read the pitches. That's already a big help. So this would be the tenor of F. You see in the first part the two first long verses, and in the second part the two Goliardic verses. And having the edition of F, you can of course compare with the neumes of the Codex Buranus, and then you can ask yourself, okay, but is it really a concordance or not? So if you look at the first line, the neumes correspond rather nicely. There are a couple of virgae on a downwards melodic movement, so that wouldn't be a complete correspondence, marked in red. And in yellow is what I consider to be a small melodic variation, but the sort of melodic shape looks to be the same. In the second part, however, in the second part, however, yes, you can see that there are really a lot of red squares. That mean the neume shape doesn't match the melodic movement. So I think this really raises the question: is the melody the same in the second part? Yes or no? What can we do of that? So yeah, is the melody the same, or is it the same only in the first part? And more generally, what is the meaning of a virga for our notating hands? Possibly Matthieu will show some example where the virga and punctum, maybe they don't have the usual melodic meaning that we are used to, of going up and down, but they may have some different meaning. And also, of course, very interesting question, I think, in which form did this piece, the Vite per Dite, come to South Tyrol? So just as a text, and then the new melody was added to it, just as a monody, or maybe as a polyphonic piece. And I think by comparing what you find in the Codex Buranus and what you find in F, and really looking closely to the relations between the neumes, the adiasematic neumes, and the melody you have, it's definitely a good starting point to sort of investigate in this direction. In the final part of my presentation, I will now address the question which gives the title to our conference. So from the source to the sound, from the parchment, let's say, to the sound. And it was really very nice to see yesterday many different approaches to this problem. Thanks, Kelly, for showing us how it was done in the 60s and 70s. So they claimed these recordings from the original manuscript. And we heard how it was done. And thanks, Baptiste and the other students, for showing us how it can be done today by improvising on the adiasematic neumes, or by taking the related sources, as you did for the middle piece, I guess. Can a digital edition help us passing from the parchment to the sound as well? So suppose you have some pattern of adiasematic neumes. So here I have a pes, a clivis, punctum, and then a clivis again. I think we all agree on the melodic meaning of these relatively simple neumes. So pes is a 2 notes, the second note is higher than the first one. Clivis, the 2 notes, the second note is lower than the first one. Pes is a single note that's lower than the previous note. So now I can take this pattern and test it against a medieval melody. So this is, for example, a troubadour melody, Volontiers Faria. May I ask our very, very competent audience, do we find this pattern in this melody? If yes, how many times? Not very easy for a human. No, it takes a bit of time. You really go through all notes and so on. I see some 3s, some 2s maybe. No? Yeah. So this is one match. The first one, 2 rising notes, then 2 downwards notes, a single one, and 2 downwards again. This is a second match. And this is a third one. So in total, we have 3 matches. So you could argue, well, this is one way of passing from the parchment to the sound. You take some adiasematic neumes, you take some existing melody, so original, so medieval melody, not improvised, Baptiste, I'm sorry. And then you can say, okay, I know how this pattern could sound like that, or like that. And of course, this is now a small example, but if you have a lot of melodies, then you can generate a lot of matching patterns. So that's what I did. You can combine digital editions and digital tools. You can automate the process. We saw that for humans it's quite challenging, but for a computer it's extremely easy to do this. You just need to have a big corpus of melodies, and then you can generate a lot of melodic patterns matching your adiasematic neumes. So luckily, since we are on top of the fortune wheel, we have some available corpora. So that the one is Troubadour Melodies database, which contains 341 melodies. And of course, you have also about 9,000 Gregorian chants, which are already digitized. So I'll just quickly show you how one could do that. So here you have a, I hope it's big enough. Maybe we can make it a bit bigger. Sort of a keyboard of neumes. I will just enter our sequence, which was a pes, clivis, then a punctum, and then a clivis again. And maybe I will just stay on the database of the troubadour melodies. And I can look for matching melodies. So you can see in 41 pieces, you can find the first pattern. 37 pieces, you can find the second pattern. And by the way, this second pattern is exactly what we had in our piece as well. So we should be able to find Volontiers Faria, that's it. That's here. And you can also have a look at the troubadour melody in its completeness there. So I think this really just wants to be an example of how you can try to pass from the parchment to sound with the help of digital tools. And I think this tool alone will never provide something useful, but if you combine it with modal improvisation, like it's possible to select by the melodies by mode, of course for the Gregorian repertoire. If you combine these sort of tools with modal improvisation, with comparison with other sources, with your personal artistic research and sensitivities, then maybe you can try to see it as another way of passing from source to the sound. So I'll go back to my slides just to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ugo, for that presentation, which really opened up all kinds of questions, I think, for all of us. I am going to invite questions from the floor first. And there are no immediate ones. Oh, good. No, I'm sorry, Mark. I'm going to barge in. So I guess the obvious thing to say about exactly where you ended was that is this question of digital corpora. Because of course we have no digital corpora of melodies for Latin song, which is the obvious place we would go if we were actually working with the Codex Buranus. And you know as well as I do you pointed to it in one of your disadvantages at the very beginning of the paper, the amount of time it takes to generate a corpus like this. And that seems to me to be. I mean, it works brilliant for Guhl-Miller, right? That's the stuff is there, and you can mess around with Troubadour quite a lot. Trouvère to an extent as well. It's not anything like as much, but it's I'm thinking the work that Stefano Milan has been doing. For example, but it's nothing like complete Latin monody. Right? I mean, Latin non-liturgical monody is a complete black hole, right? And that's extremely interesting, for me, sorely problematic. Sorry, I will let Mark talk now.
Yeah, thanks for the remark. Of course, it's a very important one. I just took as an example these two corpora, since they are, I would say, the biggest corpora that they are closer to the Codex Buranus in time and in repertoire, but of course it's not Latin songs. They most likely sound different. So yeah, very, very important remark that, of course, the right corpus to take maybe is not there.
Thank you very much for this exciting talk, and the comparison is very enticing that you're suggesting that you can actually search for melodies by just putting neumes in. I assume that you have algorithms in the background that determine whether a neume is supposed to be higher or lower than the previous one. I just noticed that in the example after the piece, there is a clivis or clinis, and in the melodies that were found to match those neumes, the clivis always started a note higher or higher than the piece.
Yeah.
I would argue that you might also, that the neumes might include the option of a melody that has a note that is lower than the second note of the piece.
For sure. So I took this decision because let's say on a technical level, the first note of a clivis is a virga, so it possibly should be higher or the same as the previous one. But it is possible to modify it here. You can see that this sequence of neumes generates a melodic pattern with some rules. So if you're looking for something different and you say, okay, but the first clivis, I don't want it necessarily to be higher, then you can put a question mark and do your search again, and you will find different results where the clivis also can start on a lower level. But let's say by default, the clivis started with a note that's higher or the same than the previous one, but you can modify this behavior for your needs. Yes.
That's wonderful. Thank you. little follow-up, if I may. So you had, in the way you're encoding the neumes, you are dismissing the idea of a diastematic approach within the Carmina Burana. And you had a comparison of neumes with the melody before, where you said we have a lot of red here, where virgae are seem to be going downwards.
Yep.
Have you compared those to the Codex to check if maybe that virga is placed lower than the one before?
Maybe I can show the manuscript for this piece. So I think the notating hand in this piece is not one of those hands where we've found some possibly adiastemacy. So this hand is very spontaneous, and you can see that for this hand in this piece, we couldn't recognize any diastemacy. There are other hands, other pieces where you can maybe see some of them, but not for this piece. So I would say in this piece, I would be keen in discarding the idea of possible diastemacy in the German, like the bilingual songs, German and Latin songs. Then you find some more hints of possible vertical displacement of the neumes, but I think not in this hand. So yes, I discarded this option for this piece, but not in general for the Codex, just for this piece.
Yeah, I don't want to contradict you, but it's always an open question if there is some diastemacy clue. In this piece, actually, you're right by saying that we don't see the diastemacy, but the question is, if the scribe is less spontaneous than we actually think or have the impression of, all these small strokes that we see, half of the neumes, look at the last line, for example, on virtutum, you have this last virga. Is it just because it's awkward, is trying to make a virga, but the quill is not running nice on the parchment, so you have this stroke at the base of the virga on tum? Or is it a sign that here we are on the semitone? Because we have also crossed virgae that seems to correspond to the place of the semitone. When it is in the base, it could be the lower place of the semitone, so you could have an E, a mi. We have all kinds of neumes like that, where we are wondering if whether it has a meaning, or it is just that it is bad written, to be very crude. So, and we have no point of comparison, because, for example, this hand, I think it's a hand that appears only on this piece. I'm not sure, but I have the impression, I looked several times, and also Laura did a lot, and this, so I cannot compare with other pieces to say, this scribe has this rule. He writes a small stroke to indicate that we are on the mi or on the fa, or it's doomed to failure.
But I think this is two slightly different questions. So one question is the vertical displacement of the neume, for which I think in this piece there is no evidence. Like the tavirga is higher than another one, or not in a systematic way, I think. The other question is small signs that or the small variation on the shapes that you can find in some neumes, and of these small tips, strokes, we found a lot in the Codex. But I think like a stroked virga like that is placed at the same height as the previous one. Looks to me. So it's sort of two separate topics. The one is the vertical displacement, the other one is a variation of sign.
Excellent. We've hit the end of the session, but Uri has a question. No, we have time, Uri. No, but we'd like to hear your conversation.
Thank you. Again, lots and lots of questions. Maybe I'll reduce it to two that I think are important in terms of where this develops further. One is, I think it's great to have the tool to find patterns in existing melodies. It could be also amazingly useful to find patterns in notated patterns, whether it be ligatures in those melodies that you have, or just to compare neume patterns to be able to find similar things elsewhere. But that's just that takes time. So you need a different corpora to compare and search, which again I don't think we really have.
It's sort of two different. So very, very important observation. The thing is, the way in which these corpora are encoded, they do not always keep track of the shapes of the neumes. They normally just keep track of the melodic movement, and they sort of forget. Like you can write the same melodic movement in many different ways using neumes. So unfortunately, this data is not available for this corpora, but it's available for, or will be available for other corpora, hopefully. So in that case, you can adapt the method.
The other questions, again, of how you design the tools is the degree to which you can incorporate fuzziness in your understanding both of signs and then in searches. For example, when we were talking a lot about is a clivis, does it have to start above or below, or is this virga wrong because the melody goes in a different direction? You can also try and incorporate a degree of fuzziness that allows for local relativity. So if you have punctus and then lots of virgas, then the punctus will be the local low note rather than an absolute everything later. All the virgas have to be the same or higher than the previous ones. Which in the example you had with the lots of red squares, a lot of them could be eliminated if you're a little bit more tolerant to a kind of fuzzy interpretation of some signs in some context. But again, it's quite hard to encode.
That would be hard, yes, because computer is very systematic. If you say a virga is a higher note, then it's higher.
But you can
like
higher within the context of a group of three notes.
But it's a difficult question because how big is your local area? Also, you mentioned like a punctum is a local minimum, yes, but how local? So it gets complicated, I think, to do it in a systematic way. Also, depending on the melody, your local range could be maybe larger or smaller. I think this gets very complicated, and this is the point where humans should kick in. And basically say, okay, computer, you're doing great, but you're wrong here.
Well, or more frighteningly, this is exactly the point at which you start writing prompts for artificial intelligence, right? I'm sorry.
Possible.
That was a. I shouldn't have said that. That was a terrible.
No. It's a big topic.
Exactly. No. For which we do not have time for now because we have now hit the end of this first half of the session. Ugo, thank you very much indeed. That was an enormously thoughtful and helpful corollary to Solomon's paper. I think that we've had a great hour and a half actually, working through some very, very subtle bits of thinking. Thank you. Thank you both. And I think we have 30 minutes for coffee now. Boy, do we need it! And it's back in the canteen, I think, isn't it? Yeah. So back here, please, at 11:15, pile, as you say in French. Welcome back, everybody. It's always a great pleasure when the speaker, just before you're about to announce them, confesses that they have the mother of all hangovers. So it's even... So it's even more of a pleasure to introduce Agnieszka Budzinska-Bennett to you, as if she needed any introduction. Agnieszka is obviously known to all of us as the director of the Ensemble Peregrina. I've lost track of how many CDs now, but that's a long and distinguished record. And one of life's greater pleasures is actually tracking Peregrina's progress across Europe and around the world on social media. It's all very edifying. But Agnieszka is a distinguished scholar as well. Her PhD is from the University of Poznań, and she is currently working at the University of Würzburg. With a long string of publications. The one I suppose I know best is, let me get the title, the title right, is Subtilitas, Audible and Inaudible Aspects of Ars Antiqua Motet, which is from 2012, a work that I've derived enormous profit from. And today she is betraying her Polish-Swiss ancestry by taking us, I don't even know what direction it is, but it's sort of northeast to Kraków, and introducing us to new concordances for works by Philip the Chancellor. Her title, Venite, Exultemus, Come Let Us Exalt the Lord, 2 new concordances of Philip the Chancellor in Kraków. Agnieszka, please.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for this hilarious introduction. I live up to the name of a Polish woman abroad. But now let's get serious. Venite Exultemus. Some years ago, I visited the provincial archives of the Order of Friars Minor Conventual in Kraków, a visit that resulted in the discovery of medieval notated fragments with numerous unidentified monophonic and 2 polyphonic pieces. According to the description on the envelope, where the fragments were rather carelessly kept, the mutilated remnants were once part of the possessions of the poor clerks. The fragments still need codicological analysis, but the script used here is the Lupulus Bastarda, also known as the Friar script, that together with the initials and some other notational traits definitely confirm Central European Franciscan provenience. As for the dating, we can assume the second half of the 14th century or the 15th century. Apart from unknown 2-part lectiones, 1 complete, I could recover several new musical concordances of conductus or non-liturgical sequences found mostly in Central European sources, often transmitted with staffless neumes or preserved without music notation at all. Most important, however, was the discovery of the 2 new concordances of works by or attributed to no other than Philip the Chancellor. The first piece that caught my eye was a new concordance of the famous sequence Ave Gloriosa Virginum Regina, here on the recto. This very piece opens the whole fascicle of 28 Latin works ascribed to Philip in the 13th century manuscript known as LOD or Egerton 274. And this piece belongs to the indisputable works of the Parisian poet. The attribution reappears in the 14th century Prague text manuscript. This sequence enjoyed a great popularity and is found in numerous sources across Europe, including French, Spanish, British, Polish, German, Italian, Belgian, English, Irish, and Scottish manuscripts, dating between the 13th and 16th centuries. Several differing lists of the concordances of Ave Gloriosa exist, some of which also contain unverified and erroneous information. I am currently revising and supplementing this list with new musical and textual concordances. I will present this part next week in the conference in Prague. So far we have 18 musical and 15 textual cognates. The verso of the Ave Gloriosa folio contains another musical composition that I could identify as Venite Exultemus regnante. Two previously known sources transmit only the text of the poem. A 13th-century Vatican manuscript and the 14th-century Basler Liederhandschrift, where this piece is ascribed to Philip the Chancellor, Cancellarius Parisiensis. As often with the vast oeuvre of the Parisian master, this attribution has been considered problematic as expressed in Peter Dronke's words. We must reckon with the possibility that some pieces may have become attached to Philip because his name and legend were still remembered, rather than because they were genuinely his. In his reflections on the Basel Liederhandschrift, Jacques Hanchin was tempted to accept Chancellor authorship of Venite, but at the same time, he doubted the attribution as no concordances of this piece are known in French sources. Gustav Meyer and Dronke referred to Hanchin's research and considered Venite Exultemus a doubtful or a mistaken attribution. Hanso Herrion too ruled out Philip's authorship of this piece. The reasons for excluding this piece from Philip's works were never made explicit, apart from its absence in French manuscripts. It is worth mentioning that unlike many other works ascribed to him, in this case, there are no conflicting attributions. The text itself was edited only by Meyer and never analyzed or discussed. The poetic structure was briefly mentioned only by Hanchin, who considered it a lay. Using the Krakow discovery of Venite, with its music almost complete, lucky us, I would like to take a closer look at this composition and explore the possibility of a more secure attribution, being fully aware that there can be no simple formula for attributing new poems to Philip the Chancellor. I am confident, however, that we can gain some insight while looking into the newly discovered melody of Venite. I would also like to present some aspects of its transmission that might support this attribution. Before I do so, I would like to make some remarks on the text edition and music transcription that you got in a handout. The text outline in my handout uses now the versical structure evident in the music as preserved in the Kraków source, which is different from Meyer's division informed by the text alone in the Basler Liederhandschrift. The scribe in Kraków is generally aware of the pairs of strophes and uses red initials to mark them. The missing text bits in my edition are supplemented from the earliest Vatican text source, 13th century. It transmits the extra double strophes 4 and 5 that are absent in the Basler Liederhandschrift, so it's a longer version. Unfortunately, exactly these strophes are missing in the Kraków source due to the mutilation. However, estimating the space foreseen for the text and music in Kraków fragment, it seems plausible that they were also part of this version. The reconstruction of the missing fragments of music was possible thanks to the double versical structure of the piece that allows us to restore most of the composition. The truly missing bits, such as versicle 1, 4, 5, 6, and the very end of the piece, versicle 19, had to be almost entirely recomposed. We will hear this reconstruction and/or recomposition at the end of my presentation. Already the medieval sources ascribed dozens of poems to Philip, above all the contemporaneous reports as Salim Bennett's chronicle, as well as several attributions in the manuscripts located in London, Darmstadt, and Prague. More pieces were proposed by Guido Reves, Friedrich Ludwig, and Gordon Anderson, with some doubt expressed by Robert Falk, who questioned some of the Darmstadt attributions and thus reduced the canon. Some years later, Peter Dronke successfully restored the authorship of the Darmstadt poems, and it was Dronke who made a comprehensive list of characteristics of Philip's poetry that was later extended by Thomas Paine and David Trail, with further attributions, especially while discussing the authors of Carmina Burana songs. The list of Philip's poetic features has been extended by Barbara Schetter and Katarzyna Grochowska. Even though we find some contradicting opinions between these scholars, and despite the fact that their new attributions often are driven by taste, we can still extract the main stylistic traits of the Chancellor's poetry they all agree on. One of the best-known poetic techniques used by Philip is the rampant annominatio. But even though Venite does not indulge in the excessive wordplay and puns often found in his works, it still shows many idiosyncratic features of his poetry. In the strophe 12a, we find the euphonic chain of nouns with the T alliteration, with the addition of the obviously deliberate usage of single and double R. Terra timore, tremore, terrore, conquitur horrendo. A similar chain of adjectives is found in the parallel strophe 12b. Additionally, it makes use of the alliteration of the predominant sibilant S. Sol nigriore, livore, calore, subfunditur stupendo. The very short lines, often consisting of only a single word, are a very well-known characteristic trait of Philip's poems. We can observe similar poetic devices in the double strophe 14. This frugality of rhyme in Philip's poems often contributes to the cohesiveness of the text. The steady rhyme is also used in several other strophes. Strophe 7 and 8 employ the monorhyme atus. This natus, necatus, devoratus, sublimiatus. This rhyme is present also in the second strophe of another poem attributed to Philip, Homo quam sit pura, that similarly enumerates Christ's sufferings. Another monorhyme, orum, covers the lengthy passage with versicles 15, 16, and 17. The choice of words in the middle section of the poem, strophe 7a, is not without significance, especially the repeated use of the adjective novus, novus Adam natus, novus Abel necatus, which resembles the Philippine design of another conductus, Serena Virginum, with arca nove legis, tronus novi regis. Striking is here the use of alliteration N and A, the latter in the names, Adam, Abel. Regarding the topic of the poem, strophe 7a exemplifies one of Philip's favorite devices, namely the usage of biblical parables. Even though he often uses the New Testament motifs on the foolish virgins or the prodigal son, he is equally interested in the Old Testament. The above-mentioned strophe 7a enumerates Old Testament names, Adam, Abel, Jonas, Elias, David, and Joseph, that all represent figura Christi. Also, an enumeration of passion tortures, strophe 14, as found in others of Philip's conductus and motets, make this attribution quite likely. Moreover, the final lines of Venite Exultemus, strophe 19, bring forth the motive of Christ as a stern judge. Pange lingua judicem qui cruce regnavit. This feature is found in the closing stanzas of several other poems by Philip and is considered his poetic imprint. Such topical, textual, and even literal correspondences have often been used to consider questions of authorship. As Trail puts it, inevitably, when it comes to anonymous poems, we feel more confident about attributions that are based on a number of features, especially features that are particularly idiosyncratic. However, there is danger of a trap of analogies found in attributions proposed by modern scholars. And even literal correspondences are not always a compelling argument for attributions, as quotations might be deliberate borrowings from another poet. However, Philip in general avoids direct quotations from the Bible and offers sophisticated paraphrases instead. Already the beginning of the poem is a reworked borrowing from Psalm 94 with the same incipit. Do note, for example, the substitute vultum for the biblical faciem. Yet another example, however, might throw even more light on the questions of the Chancellor's possible authorship of Venite. Strophe 9b paraphrases the biblical vision of Ezekiel, later developed in the Book of Revelations, that mentions Homo, Vitulus, Leo, and Aquila, a group of 4 figures that are associated with the 4 evangelists. This ensemble often depicts the 4 stages of Christ's work, interpreting the tetramorph in Venite: born as a man, sacrificed as an ox, resurrected as a lion, and ascended as a king of bird and eagle. This popular passage has been paraphrased in numerous ways in various glossae, inscriptions, and simple prayers throughout the centuries. And its quadruple structure carries some poetic potential in itself, as the verbs tend to rhyme. Here are some examples starting with Gregory the Great himself. Nascendo, moriendo, resurgendo, ascendendo, used in different combinations. It is precisely the variety of the paraphrases of this passage that is available that astonished me when I found an entire unchanged strophe of Venite as a poetic insert in Collationes in Hexameron by Saint Bonaventura, preaching on the mystery of the redemption. Through the 4 evangelists, Christ takes on the following meanings. For Matthew, he is said to be a meek man. For Mark, a truly triumphant lion. For Luke, a slain calf. And for John, he has the appearance of a soaring eagle. Hence the poet rightly sang, Homo fit nascendo, vos cruce moriendo, leo resurgendo, rex avium scanendo. Not only is the quotation exact, but it is also introduced by the remark unde bene cantavit versificator, hence the poet rightly sang. In medieval texts, the term versificator is reserved for a great poet. This would perfectly agree with the status of Philip the Chancellor. And the use of the verb cantavit instead of the much more usual dixit, dicit, or ait would imply that Bonaventura heard Venite in a sung delivery rather than known it as a poem. Ergo, the probability that the music of Venite, as preserved in Kraków source, is late medieval transmission of the 13th century piece, it increases significantly. Saint Bonaventura, born in the Papal States as Giovanni di Fidanza, took up his studies in Paris about the year 1235, and he still could have met Philip, who died 1 year later. Both could have met through the Franciscan connection, as the Chancellor held the friars minor in high esteem and apparently, at his own request, was buried in a chapel belonging to this order. Bonaventura became a friar almost a decade later. He held his Collationes in Hexameron, an unfinished series of lectures in Paris in 1273, in front of an audience of over 150 students. Bonaventura was known for quoting not only the fathers of the church, but also more recent authorities such as Anselm of Canterbury, Bernard de Clairvaux, or Hugo de Saint-Victor. Inserting a poetic quote from Philip's sequence into his readings, he would have cited an authority known to his listeners, and most likely one known and meaningful to himself. The musical arguments seem to strengthen the case for Philip's authorship. Despite the fragmentary transmission in Kraków, we can retrieve most of the music of Venite with a good degree of accuracy, thanks to the paired strophic structure typical for the lay sequence. According to Payne, Philip the Chancellor could very well have played a role in the formulation of the conductus into sequence-like forms. Even though there are no similar pieces in F mode found within Philip's acknowledged oeuvre, we can find many similarities with the Ave Gloriosa, the neighboring sequence in the Kraków source, a piece firmly ascribed to Philip. Both works consist of several double versicles of different lengths and are overwhelmingly syllabic. The pieces are similar in ambitus. Both operate with short phrases and employ the cellular method of construction, using a pool of melodic formulae. Both pieces also show a tendency to shorten versicles towards the end. There are reoccurring cadences at the end of numerous phrases that join consecutive segments together in a similar way as the poetic text is bound by the rhyme. In Ave, only 4 versicles out of 12 do not make use of the recurring cadence. In Venite, we find this cadence in the end of almost half of the versicles. Both cadences are melodically similar as well. Further, we can notice a motivic patterning used to articulate verse structure in Ave Gloriosa. The same technique applies to Venite. Phrase A in Venite, and you have the number of versicles, is constantly interwoven with phrase B. In this way, they create some kind of overall musical architecture with regularly appearing ABA-BA or ABA structures. This progressive repetition is a device that was abundantly applied throughout Ave Gloriosa. Ave juggles with 5 different recurring melodies. While attributing some works to the Chancellor, Dronki clearly expressed the need for musical evaluation by Notre Dame experts, since, as in our case, through showing clear musical links with songs acknowledged as Philip's in other sources, some conjectures could well come nearer to being certainties. And these do not even have to be other sources, as the strong connection between Ave Gloriosa and Venite become even clearer when we have a closer look at their parallel transmission. Venite appears in no source without Ave Gloriosa. In the Kraków fragment, its missing first lines must have started directly after Ave. In the Vatican source, Ave appears a couple of pages further after Venite, and both are rare examples of poetry in this manuscript that contains mainly sermons. In the Basler Liederhandschrift, Ave, found on folio 151, precedes Venite by a couple of folios. Basically, wherever we look, these 2 pieces seem to travel together, not only as text, but also, in our Kraków fragment, as musical compositions. The Basler Liederhandschrift, with the 2 attributions to Philip, invites some further observations. As already noticed by Hanchin, the rubric Conductus Cancellarii Parisiensis by O Amor Deus might be understood as plural and refer to the cluster of pieces written on folios 147 till 155. All 5 compositions notated here can be considered conductus, strophic, or in a sequence form, including Philip's unchallenged Ave Gloriosa, that in Basel actually bears no rubric. After strictly liturgical pieces that follow, mostly Benedicamus tropes, the scribe repeats the rubric in the beginning of Venite, mentioning, however, only the author, Cancellarius Parisiensis, and skipping the genre. Interestingly, two other pieces found in the Basler Liederhandschrift, to which the broader understanding of the rubric could apply, O Si mihi rhetorica and O nobilis virginitas, are also transmitted in the Krakow fragments, the latter complete. Why then not consider the late medieval attribution true? Since it is methodologically impossible to answer the question of authenticity with absolute certainty, Schetter advises relying on the medieval handwritten attributions as a working basis. In the case of Venite, I would like to add yet another reason for doing so. Along with the mutilated fragments, the Franciscan archive is in the possession of a folder with some handwritten notes and transcriptions. According to the archivist, they belong to the Franciscan monk, Friar Fulgentius Bonk. Even though the short description on the folder mentions music from medieval Franciscan or Clarist songbooks, on the pages containing a part of the transcription of the text of Ave Gloriosa, yet unrecognized, we can read more specifically the note Antiphonale of the Clares from Krakow, 13th century. Even though the dating cannot be correct, the current estimate of the age of the fragments aims at the end of 14th or 15th century, the provenience from the Clarist convent in southern Poland does not come as a surprise. The first convent of the Order of St. Clare in Poland was founded in 1245 in Zawichost by Blessed Salomea, who was the sister of Poland's ruler Bolesław the Chaste. Due to the brutal Mongol invasions, the community eventually moved to Kraków in 1320, where it resides close to St. Andrew's Church until today. Another monastery was founded in 1280 in Stare Sącz by the Duke's wife herself, St. Kinga of Hungary. Even though both convents possess numerous 13th and 14th century graduals and antiphonarists, and their sources also transmit some simple polyphony, it was Kinga's love for music that secured the astonishing holdings of the Stare Sącz cloister library. Not only does it hold the fragments of a copy of the Parisian Magnus Liber, but also a single leaf with a four-part Omnia Beneficia, a unique conductus dating around 1300, apparently a local product being modeled on the latest musical trends from Paris. The Parisian fragments themselves contain some organa, but most notably numerous motets, some of which are unica, of which, according to the newest research by Grochowska, 24 can be ascribed to Philip the Chancellor. Such a prominent presence of Philip's work in Kinga's monastery is not the only reason I would like to propose Stare Sącz and not Kraków as the original place to which our newly discovered fragments were imported or for which they were copied. The Stare Sącz library is in possession of another fragment of Ave Gloriosa sequence. It is a single parchment leaf, first identified by Mirosław Perz. The research was continued by Robert Curry, who not only confirmed the Chancellor's authorship, but also discovered that the music is another version of the standard melody of Ave Gloriosa or its second voice. Both versions of Ave Gloriosa as well as Venite correspond very well to the content of the Notre Dame manuscript fragments held in Stare Sącz. And in this way, Venite would join the company of many other pieces by or firmly ascribed to Philip. It is also worth remembering that the educated nuns in the Clarist monastery of Stare Sącz, following the example of Franciscan friars, were aspiring to the prestigious title Moniales Literate and were particularly fond of the Parisian style. So even though the Chancellor's texts were found in numerous manuscripts widely disseminated throughout Europe, the Polish clerics in Stare Sącz might well have been interested in possessing the codices or even loose folios containing the works of such a well-known poet or versificator. I do hope that we can discuss or question my arguments about this attribution, and I hope that I showed you a variety of arguments. But before we do it, I am very, very grateful to my dear colleague Mathieu Romanens, who will present now Venite Exultemus in my part recomposition in the few places where it had to be done. And I'm very, very grateful, Mathieu, to you.
Venite exultemus, regnanti jubilemus, nostroque salutari dari, semper menos gaudemus. Donantis vultum mero vero, corde preoccupemus. Super nesion filiae, crucis congaudent gloriae, tanto plene mysterio. Quondam crux ignominiae, laudis nunc est victoriae, mundi preclara pretio. Purgetur gratuletur omnis vatio, pletetur glorietur nostra consium. Palma expreciosa rosa, pervernans ad quelidium. Luctantis Jacobs calamara tollis vitali premium. Te lignum vitae sitio plantatum ab initio in paradisi medio. Te lingua mens vultet actio, tu justis delectatio, tu mundi restauratio. Novus Adam natus, novus Abel necatus, Jonas devoratus, Elias sublimatus. Serpens pallodatus, David infatuatus, Vervex immolatus, Iosef incarceratus. Homo fit nascendo, bos cruce moriendo, Leo resurgendo, Rex avium scandendo. Se sic exina livit, ab tartara subivit, Petra clausus exhibit, et celos repellivit. Lapis reprobatus, sub angulo locatus. Tau poste signatus, agnus immaculatus. Terra timore, tremore, terrore, concutitur horrendo. Sol nigriore, livore, calore, subfunditur stupendo. Sol quia verus occidit, qui concidit momenta. Nox horitur dum moritur, panduntur monumenta. Vita beata, ligata, plagata, clavata, servis colla fizzata. Felle potata nudata damnata mactata lancea perforata. Corpora sanctorum resurguns plurimorum, cetus populorum multos vidit illorum. Aduc perfidorum gens furit Judeorum, ad objecta quorum silet Deus Deorum. Omirum dolorum cumulus probrorum, spina florem florum regem cingit cenorum. Clavis David codicem clausum reseravit, Christus vivit calicem mortem mortis travit. Cum cruore laticem latus propinavit, pange lingua judicem qui crucem regnavit.
Thank you, Mathieu. Thank you, Agnieszka, for an extraordinary set of discoveries that are going to change quite a lot of how we think about some of this music. Questions from the floor? Excellent. So the thing that interested me about the question of attribution, and actually the thing that I found most convincing as an attribution to Philip is the Bonaventura quote, actually. That seems to me to be fairly unambiguous. And I suppose the question is, do we have any other references to Philippe specifically being described as versificator? I mean, I take it as read that versificator means exactly how you described it, but cantavit is very elusive, obviously. But I'm just wondering, we don't have any other references to Philippe from, let's say, 20, 30 years after his death, where he's actually called versificator.
No, unfortunately not. Of course, I looked for that. That would have been great. He's mostly mentioned as an excellent sermonista and a theologian. It's true, it's not so often mentioned that he was, I mean, he's an author, but it's never referred in a like praising tones that how great a poet he was. This comes much later, and it's mostly like to be read from the reception of his work. But no documents that I went through speaking about him or exactly around his death, and there's lots of documents about his death as well, because that was a complicated story. No, they don't mention that. And but versificator, I mean, there are some names that are connected to this in other sources, but I mean, it could really apply in a sense, like, yeah.
I mean, even without the attribution, frankly, finding a quotation from a piece like that in a text like like Bonaventura, that is quite something in its own right. I would say.
Maybe add something. Of course, this Bonaventura sermons are written down also a bit later, and there are two traditiones. The more popular Traditio B. And the one, Traditio I, is the where we have this quote from, which took me like really months to find, actually. Seems to be like first-hand account, and yet we have only later sources, again, 15th century sources. And this bit is only in this one Traditio. The more vast Traditio B doesn't have any poetic inserts, so it's just like really sermons. So this is also maybe something to check extra, but of course I was so happy to find it, and at least one. Yeah.
That's extremely interesting. Thank you. It kind of responds to a broader question, and one on which I'm afraid I have strong views, which is the growing attribution of pretty well every Ritmus to Philip the Chancellor by classical philologists. I'm thinking of David Trell in particular, who just seems to have a pathological desire to attribute everything to Philip the Chancellor, in ways that actually for most of the classical philologists, medieval classical philologists that I rate most highly, don't get upset about. And it does kind of go back to Dronke. You know, he has this whole thing about poetic individuality in the Middle Ages. That's the title of one of his books. And most of his contemporaries kind of, you know, are kind of less hung up about questions of authorship, poetic identity, attribution, and all this kind of, and interested in more things. That 1987 article is has been influential, in my view, not in a great way. I was in the room where he read the paper for that article actually emerged from, it was a long time ago, but I remember thinking that this feels like this is old thinking. You know, this kind of desperate search for you know, and it's the same for attributing music, right? I mean, you know, it's something that I think we're probably comfortable with now. The idea of anonymity and finding other ways of making sense of repertories that go beyond named composers, or in this case, named poets. I just find it slightly strange, but maybe others in the room will have a different view on this. I said I have very strong views, and Kelly, wait, you need the microphone.
Thank you very much. Actually, my point isn't at all about that, but thank you for that. My question is actually to the broader idea of reconstruction, because you've taken fragments, you've taken texts, and you've then reconstructed a performing version. And it's obvious that you've been able to use some internal elements where there are sequence verse pairs. How else did you go about it? Were you using Philip models, or what were your ideas?
The problem is exactly as I mentioned. There are no. I mean, first of all, we have a question of genre, and this Philip's sequences, they're absolutely different musically, stylistically than his conductus. Then we have very few pieces in F. And the pieces in F that I looked at are only conductus with caude, so they just don't give me this degree of syllabic treatment, so I really cannot retrieve anything that would be plausible in this context of, as we could very well hear, like quite a chatty piece, so to say. It's really text. I even smuggled in a small two new tones in the beginning, just to have a little bit of an opening and not to get stuck in the syllabic stuff. It was not possible. I really could refer only to what I have in this fragment. And sometimes in the places where I didn't have the music, I still had some kind of stems. So I was trying to understand how far would the stem go. So is it a D, is it an E, maybe F? And then, of course, going with some relatively simple modality here. I mean, we could all hear there was a bit eintönig. The piece is exciting on different level. The drama delivery, which is very, very Philippine, I think, with the outbursts, with terra timore, terrore, this is something that we have in conductus. We don't have it so much in Ave Gloriosa, because Ave Gloriosa is just an enumeration of Virgin's epithets. So there was not such a dramatic moment. But no, I could only help myself with the material here. Try to do is as well as it gets, but I'm absolutely open for any other reconstruction proposals. Maybe, Mathieu, after you have sang it, maybe there was something that was going against your interiorized model understanding. Yeah, I mean, this is an open question, but I mean, I think it was marked precisely, so you could see what's there and what's added, and reconstructed one level and recomposed another level.
I found it highly convincing, I wanted to say, and it reminded me of maybe some other Polish sequences that we've confronted.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm a lay person. I play Baroque. I study Baroque music, so I have no idea about anything. But what struck me in this piece of music is how much self-reference there is from versicle to versicle in the music. And I was wondering if that was something that was common for Philippe Le Chancelier's conductus, or in
genre.
that style?
For this genre, yes, because Ave Gloriosa, as I tried to mention, we didn't hear it, we didn't see the music, but it's very, very built in a very similar way. They're really like parallel pieces in two different modes. Ave Gloriosa is in G, but it's like really playing with the same motives and changing slightly. But then, of course, if we get into that, the changes are meaningful, even if it's just a 1 second or one added tone. We know, in medieval music, we know how important one tone change can be, or one pitch, like 1 second can be, and how much impact it brings. So it is self-referential, yes, but it belongs to the style, and I think he was just using in this very piece, this very monotonous parts, so to say, they were not beautiful, to prepare the outburst. I see his strategy there, and I think it worked well, because I saw your faces, you were all surprised that all of a sudden the air debaped. Thank you.
I will ask a weird question. So we assume that the music is by Philippe Le Chancellor. Anzo is not here right now. I
That's
wish
right.
you're here.
No.
Yeah, it makes sense, but there is still this question.
It's a big question, because I mean, also Ave Gloriosa attributed to him, is it his music?
So because you were saying that his conductors are quite different in style, but because this is a genre, maybe also that imposes.
I mean, here my anchor was really Ave Gloriosa with this incredibly steady transmission, and with, what did I say, 18 sources with music. That it's actually very steady, so that the music doesn't change. So we can rely on early transmission, 13th century, and other manuscripts going up to 16th century even, where it's still the same, imagine. Yeah, this is very interesting. This is next week in Prague. You can come again. But yeah, of course it's a question. I think also your question is very, not weird, it's very general, because we very often assume that his, both things are his, and we know that it's, we have this remark that that's his text and the music was written by, it's just like a little bit like usual tendency, but yeah.
That's the problem when we have authors, actually. Yeah. When we have known, we don't imagine that the author of the text is different from the composer. So.
Exactly, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly, and I suppose that actually throws into relief that line, if it is from Bonaventura, about cantavit versificator, which is rather nice. Yeah. Okay, so we're past noon. Thank you very much, Agnieszka. Thank you very much, Mathieu, for the comments. All splendid. So we're going to finish early for lunch. I've lost my program. We restart at 2:30. So don't behave too badly in the 2.5 hours that you have available to you, and we'll see you back here at 2:30. Lunch is presumably in the.
For presenters and invited people, the lunch is in Restaurant zum. Just follow the group. I will be there. I will go ahead and just follow me or follow Laura. Or, yeah.